One busy morning, at the bustling headquarters of SummitTech Enterprises, an elderly man named Edward Carter entered through the sleek glass doors. Among the neatly dressed staff with polished shoes and confident smiles, Edward stood out in his worn-out shirt, old canvas shoes, and a tilted cap. Despite the contrast, he carried himself with quiet dignity. He approached the receptionist, a young woman with a perfectly tailored suit and a dismissive expression. With a polite smile, Edward asked, "Excuse me, miss. I'd like to apply for a security guard position here. Could you guide me to the right person?" The receptionist raised an eyebrow, scanning him from head to toe. She responded with a mix of surprise and disdain. "Sir, this company has very high standards. I don't think you're what we're looking for." Edward's smile didn't waver. "I just need a simple job. I don't need high pay," he replied gently, his voice steady. Her condescending tone caught the attention of a passing employee, Mark Thompson, who smirked and laughed loudly. Turning to the receptionist, he said, "Seriously? He thinks he can guard this place? We hire young and strong people here, not old folks." Mark's laughter rippled through the nearby staff, drawing more attention to the scene. Edward remained calm, unbothered by the growing crowd. Once again, he repeated his request to meet the hiring manager, his patience unwavering. The commotion grew as more employees gathered, whispering and chuckling at the sight of Edward standing resolutely at the reception desk. His worn appearance and quiet demeanor became the center of their mockery. Whispers of, "Does he even know where he is?" and "This is SummitTech, not some corner store," floated through the crowd. The noise eventually reached James Collins, the HR manager. Known for his sharp suits and even sharper tongue, James was a young professional who took great pride in the company's elite standards. He strode towards the growing crowd, his expression impatient. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his tone cold and authoritative. The receptionist gestured towards Edward. "This man says he's here to apply for a job," she explained with a smirk. James turned to Edward, his eyes narrowing. "You're here to apply? For what position?" Edward met his gaze calmly. "I'd like to apply for the security guard position, sir." James let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That's quite amusing. A company like ours cannot hire someone as old and frail as you." Edward's calm demeanor didn't falter. He responded softly, "Sometimes people like me can do more than you expect." James's laughter grew louder, drawing chuckles from the crowd. "If you can prove that, I'll personally invite you to join us," he said mockingly. Edward turned to leave, but paused at the door. Looking back at James, he said in a steady voice, "One day, you'll realize judging someone by appearances can be the biggest mistake of your life." His words hung in the air, silencing the crowd for a moment before the whispers and laughter resumed. Edward walked away, leaving behind a room full of dismissive stares. A few days later, SummitTech hummed with its usual energy. Employees shuffled papers, tapped away on keyboards, and hustled through meetings. The incident with the old man had already been forgotten, replaced by the pressing deadlines and high-stakes projects. That morning, however, the routine was interrupted. A sleek black luxury car with a VIP license plate pulled up to the entrance. Its polished surface gleamed in the sunlight, catching the eyes of curious employees. "Who's that?" whispered one employee as the car door opened. A tall, middle-aged man with a commanding presence stepped out. Richard Lawson, a name synonymous with power and respect in the business world, adjusted his tailored jacket before turning to his assistant. His piercing gaze swept over the building as he said, "Summon the HR manager. I need to discuss a recent interview incident." The news of Richard's arrival spread quickly, creating ripples of excitement and curiosity. James Collins, the HR manager, was in the middle of reviewing applications when his assistant entered the room, her face pale. "Mr. Lawson is here to see you," she said nervously. James frowned, confused. "Lawson? The Richard Lawson?" She nodded. "He's waiting in the executive lounge. He mentioned something about an interview." James adjusted his tie and smoothed his suit, his nerves tingling. He hurried to the lounge, unsure of what to expect. When he entered, Richard stood by the window, his back to James. Turning slowly, Richard's expression was cold and unreadable. "Mr. Collins," he began, his tone sharp, "I heard you interviewed an elderly man a few days ago." James blinked, caught off guard. "Yes, sir," he stammered. "But he wasn't fit for the role. I explained politely and sent him away." Richard's eyes narrowed. "Politely?" he asked, his voice laced with disdain. Or did you humiliate him for not meeting your superficial standards? James felt the blood drain from his face. Sir, Richard raised a hand, cutting him off. Do you even know who that man is? He demanded. He's someone I deeply respect. Without him, I wouldn't be standing here today. The words hit James like a thunderclap. His mind raced as Richard's piercing gaze bore into him. Turning to his assistant, Richard said firmly, Find him immediately. I want to meet him before the day ends. James opened his mouth to protest, but Richard's icy glare silenced him. Prepare to apologize, Richard added, his tone final. Today, you'll learn the true worth of a person lies beyond appearances. Richard Lawson's words echoed in James Collins' mind as he made his way to the company's private offices. James couldn't fathom what was happening. The elderly man, Edward Carter, was nothing more than a humble, disheveled figure, hardly the type of person someone like Richard would hold in high regard. But the way Richard spoke, there was something in his tone that demanded respect. As James nervously awaited the call from the assistant, he found himself pacing back and forth in his office. He couldn't shake off the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Who was this man, really? Hours later, the assistant returned, breathless. Mr. Collins, we've located Mr. Carter. His address is in a modest neighborhood on the outskirts of town. She hesitated. But I think you should know, Mr. Lawson insisted on going to him personally. James's eyes widened. What? He can't. Before he could finish his thought, Richard walked into the office. His presence seemed to freeze the room. I've already given the order, Richard said, his voice firm and unyielding. I'm going to see him now. You, Mr. Collins, will accompany me, and you'll learn the true nature of your mistake. James swallowed hard, knowing there was no escaping what was coming. He nodded silently, feeling the weight of the situation press down on him. The drive to Edward Carter's home was long and quiet, with Richard seated in the back of the car, eyes focused on the road ahead. James sat beside him, full of anxiety and regret, silently dreading the moment they would meet the man he had so cruelly dismissed. As the car turned onto a quiet street and stopped in front of a modest house, the contrast between the grand headquarters of SummitTech and Edward's humble abode could not have been more striking. The house was simple, well-kept, and exuded a quiet dignity that made it feel all the more powerful. Richard got out of the car first, his posture composed and respectful, and James followed, his steps hesitant. As they approached the door, it opened, and Edward stood there, as calm and composed as he had been the day they first met at SummitTech. Ah, Richard, Edward greeted warmly, his face lighting up with recognition. You've come. Richard bowed deeply. Sir, I've heard about the disrespect you faced at my company. I deeply apologize. But today, I'm here not just to say sorry, but to bring you back to where you belong. Edward smiled softly. I hold no grudges. They were simply doing what they thought was right. But sometimes, people need a reminder of what truly matters. Richard nodded, his eyes filled with gratitude. You taught me more than I could ever repay, Mr. Carter. I will make sure your wisdom is honored at SummitTech. Edward gestured for them to come inside, and they shared a quiet meal, the air thick with unspoken history and respect. Richard had learned the painful lesson of humility, but he knew that it was only the beginning of the truth that awaited. Years before, Edward Carter had been a successful entrepreneur, a man known not just for his impressive craftsmanship, but for his compassionate leadership. As the owner of Carter Woodworks, he had built a business based on trust, integrity, and human connection. Employees didn't just work for him, they flourished under his guidance. Many considered Edward not just a boss, but a mentor, a figure who genuinely cared about their well-being. I'm not wealthy because of money, but because of the people around me, Edward often said, and those words resonated deeply with everyone who worked under him. But fate had other plans. A devastating fire had destroyed Edward's factory and his home, claiming the lives of his beloved wife and son. The pain from the loss was unbearable, and in the wake of the tragedy, Edward sold his remaining assets to pay off debts. Disillusioned and heartbroken, he disappeared from the public eye, retreating into the shadows to live a quiet, humble life. But Richard Lawson, a young, ambitious employee who had once worked under Edward, had never forgotten the lessons he had learned from his old mentor. Edward had seen potential in Richard and had helped him grow, providing opportunities for education and advancement. Richard's success in building his own company was a direct result of the wisdom Edward had imparted. Richard had often wondered what had happened to Edward, the man who had shaped so much of his life. He never forgot the kindness and guidance Edward had shown him, and when he had the chance, he sought him out, hoping to offer him a life he so rightly deserved. After Richard's visit to Edward's home, the truth became clear. Edward's impact on SummitTech, on Richard, and on the business world at large was immeasurable. The world had not known the full extent of his contributions, but Richard was determined to change that. The next morning, a sleek, black luxury car pulled up in front of SummitTech's imposing glass building. The employees who had once mocked Edward watched in awe as the doors of the car opened. Out stepped a man in a perfectly tailored suit, a man whose presence demanded respect. Edward Carter. As he walked towards the entrance, the staff, who had previously laughed and dismissed him, stared in disbelief. They could not fathom that the frail old man they had humiliated was now walking into the building with more dignity and power than any of them could ever dream of. Inside, James stood frozen, his face pale. He had no idea what to expect. He had just spent the last several days trying to process everything Richard had told him. But seeing Edward in front of him now, his once proud demeanor seemed to crumble in the face of the truth. Richard stepped forward and addressed the staff, his voice calm but firm. "Allow me to introduce Mr. Edward Carter, my mentor, one of this company's founding shareholders, and the man who helped make SummitTech what it is today." The room fell silent. Gasps of disbelief filled the air as the employees who had ridiculed Edward realized the weight of their mistake. The very man they had dismissed as inconsequential was, in fact, one of the pillars on which SummitTech had been built. James's face turned crimson, and he struggled to speak, but no words came. He felt the crushing weight of his own ignorance. The office buzzed with tension as Edward Carter stepped through the doors of SummitTech, dressed in a crisp, dark suit that spoke volumes of his timeless dignity. The transformation was striking. No longer the disheveled elderly man they had mocked, but a figure of authority and respect. The employees, who had once laughed at his humble appearance, now stood frozen, eyes wide in disbelief. Richard stood beside him, his demeanor calm but filled with quiet pride. The contrast between the sharp, modern elegance of SummitTech and the quiet humility of Edward was impossible to ignore. But now everyone understood that the strength of SummitTech was not just in its technology, but in the values it had once been built upon. Values that Edward Carter had embodied for years before stepping away from the public eye. James Collins stood motionless at the front, his face ashen with regret. He had witnessed the power of Edward's presence and was now realizing the magnitude of his past mistakes. The mocking words he had thrown at the elderly man were coming back to haunt him. Richard cleared his throat, taking a step forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce you to someone very important. Mr. Edward Carter, my mentor, and one of the founding shareholders of this company." A hushed murmur spread across the room as the employees processed the truth. They had never known the full story. They had never understood that it was Edward who had helped put SummitTech on the map, who had invested his knowledge and his wisdom in the company long before anyone had ever heard of it. Edward smiled faintly at the stunned faces surrounding him, his presence commanding the room without a single word spoken. He turned to James, whose eyes were wide with realization and guilt. "Mr. Collins?" Edward said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that seemed to echo throughout the office. "Do you understand now the value of a person isn't in their appearance, their age, or their status? It is in their heart, in their integrity, in their ability to lead with kindness and respect." James could barely meet Edward's gaze. He had been so quick to judge, to dismiss the elderly man without even considering what lay beneath the surface. Now, as the truth unfolded, he realized that he had been the one who was truly unworthy of the job he held. Edward's words hung in the air, and the room grew heavy with the weight of the lesson being imparted. Richard's eyes were steady, proud of his mentor for not only teaching him the value of hard work and resilience, but also showing the world that true worth lies far beyond the surface. He had always admired Edward for the way he lived his life, and now the entire company would bear witness to that wisdom. Imagine the shame of treating a founder of this company with such disrespect, Richard continued, turning to James, his voice unwavering. If not for Mr. Carter, none of us would be here today. We would not have SummitTech. We would not have the success we now enjoy. His vision, his generosity, and his leadership laid the foundation for everything we've built. The words stung James deeply, but he knew he deserved it. He had mocked a man who had given everything to others, who had built something from the ground up, only to quietly step away when tragedy struck. James had been so focused on his own career that he hadn't taken the time to learn the history of the company he worked for. He hadn't cared about the people who had made it great. Edward looked around at the staff, his gaze kind but firm. I didn't return to demand anything. I didn't come here to take control. I came here to see if the people who now stand at the helm of this company understand what matters most: integrity, respect, and character. A long silence followed as everyone absorbed his words. Richard, who had learned from the best, felt a deep sense of responsibility to carry forward the legacy of kindness, respect, and hard work that Edward had always embodied. And now, more than ever, he realized how important it was to instill those values in every employee of SummitTech. James took a deep breath, finally stepping forward. Mr. Carter, I am truly sorry. I misjudged you, and I've come to realize just how wrong I was. I will do whatever it takes to ensure this mistake is never repeated. Edward nodded, his expression warm yet stern. Apologies are a start, but actions speak louder than words. I trust you will take that to heart. In the days that followed, SummitTech underwent a transformation. The once elite, impersonal company began to take on the values that Edward had always championed: respect for every individual, regardless of their background, age, or appearance. A commitment to fostering an environment where integrity and kindness were just as important as innovation and profits. Edward's teachings became a cornerstone of the company's culture, and Richard, now fully embracing his role as a leader, made sure to uphold those values at every level. SummitTech's employees, who had once looked down on Edward, now sought his counsel, eager to learn from the man who had given them the very company they worked for. They had learned the hard way that true greatness wasn't measured by titles or wealth. It was measured by the way one treated others and the strength of their character. Richard made it official, offering Edward the position of senior advisor. We need your wisdom, Mr. Carter. Your leadership is the foundation on which SummitTech was built, and it will continue to be the guiding light for the future. Edward accepted, a quiet smile on his face as he looked at the young employees around him, understanding that his legacy was now safe, not just in the business world, but in the hearts and minds of those who would carry it forward. Let this be a place, Edward said in his final words to the company, where everyone, regardless of their background, is valued for who they are. Let us build something that transcends money and success, something that lasts because it's built on respect. From that day forward, SummitTech flourished in ways it never had before. The employees worked with a renewed sense of purpose, driven by the principles that Edward had instilled in them. And though Edward's time as an active leader in the company had ended, his presence, his lessons, remained forever etched into the fabric of SummitTech. The once dismissive employees, now humbled and wiser, looked up to Edward with a deep sense of gratitude. They had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that true worth lies in character, not in outward appearances. And so, a new chapter began for SummitTech, one rooted in humility, integrity, and the lasting wisdom of Edward Carter. As the years passed, SummitTech became more than just a company. It became a living testament to the values that Edward Carter had instilled in it. With Richard at the helm, supported by the wisdom of Edward, the company flourished not only in terms of revenue and innovation, but in the hearts of its employees, who had embraced the true essence of leadership. Respect, kindness, and integrity were no longer mere ideals, but the foundation upon which every decision was made. Edward continued to serve as senior advisor, his presence a steady reminder that the best leaders were not the ones with the loudest voices or the most wealth, but the ones who led by example, who valued people above profits, and who understood that a company's true success lay in the strength of its character. James Collins, now a more humble and introspective HR manager, took it upon himself to ensure that every new hire understood the company's values, making sure no one would ever forget the lesson he had learned the hard way. He knew that his career and the future of SummitTech depended on treating others with the same dignity he now had the privilege of offering to those around him. Edward's story, once one of humble beginnings and quiet strength, had become a legend within the company. His life was a constant reminder that appearances could be deceiving, that true worth was not measured by age, wealth, or outward appearance, but by the strength of a person's character and the impact they left on the world around them. The company continued to grow, its culture flourishing as more employees took Edward's teachings to heart. SummitTech's success was no longer just about business. It was about creating an environment where everyone, regardless of their past or their status, could thrive and be valued for who they truly were. And as Edward looked back on his journey, his rise as a craftsman, his fall from grace, and his eventual return to a place he had helped build, he knew that the legacy he had left behind was more enduring than any material wealth. It was a legacy of compassion, of respect, and of unwavering integrity, one that would carry on for generations to come. In the end, Edward Carter had proven that the most important thing a person could build wasn't a business or a fortune. It was a legacy of kindness, of teaching others the value of human dignity, and of inspiring the world to see people not for what they had or how they looked, but for who they truly were. And that, Edward knew, was the greatest success of all. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to Edward's story. We truly hope that his journey of perseverance, humility, and wisdom has inspired you, just as it has inspired everyone within SummitTech. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to like this video and share it with others who might benefit from the lesson it teaches. Also, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Your support helps us continue to bring valuable content to you, and we truly appreciate each and every one of you. Stay tuned for more stories that uplift, inspire, and remind us all of the power of kindness, respect, and character. Until next time.